Notes Towards a History of Frastinare by Steve Duffy. Impressions of Fra Pietro. A certain Fra Pietro, secretary to the travelling party of a 10th century bishop of Verona, described his arrival in Frastinare thus. It is an ancient city, opulentia in deserto, hemmed in at the foot of a fearsome escarpment, guarded by walls on every side, and bordered by the dismal shores of the Mare Adriaticum. Bound once by Constantinople's rule, then annexed to the Exarchate of Ravenna, claimed in turn by Charlemagne, it is in truth nobody's city but its own. Its ramparts guard its secrets, privata et obscura. The contemporary record of the good friar's journey is no longer extant. The passage above is quoted in an 18th century publication entitled Segreti della Regione Friuli, the work of one Jacopo lo Scrivano, translated into English by the Reverend Mr. Arnold Greer some 40 years later in 1826. Doubt has been cast by the more scrupulous scholars on Jacopo's reliability, and indeed on that of the Reverend Greer. The reader should address this citation with these factors held firmly in mind. The road to Frastinare. For many years access to the city was confined to those entering from the sea. Vessels would dock at the wharves after passing between the formidable twin watchtowers that guard the harbour entrance. A road dating back to Roman times once ran along the foot of the cliffs. It led to the northern gate of the city, La Porta Settentrionale, but it was destroyed by a landslide in the winter of some dauntingly remote year. Accounts differ as to the cause of this incident, but down the centuries a disproportionate amount of seismic activity has been logged in the region. It is notable that successive Marchesi of Frastinare made no effort to repair the road until the mid-19th century, when a land link was once more established with the blasting of a new road into the cliffside. A verbal tradition persists in neighbouring towns, but was not, curiously enough, ever recorded in Frastinare itself, that workmen discovered the entrances to various caves and tunnels in the course of their labours. Some of these tunnels were said to lead into the mountainside, while others seemed to extend down, below sea level. Simulacra. In her book An Independent Woman's Travels in Italy, 1906, Miss Bryony Staniforth has the following passage. Those intrepid travellers prepared to set aside a morning to climb the slopes above Frastinare will be amply rewarded. Below them will be spread a grand vista of the old walled town, as if laid out in miniature scale. Those with an eye for similitude will note a curious aspect of the town's walls and the general shape of the promontory they defend, namely, a similarity to the outline of a flatfish, a turbot, say, or a flounder. The harbour forms the gaping maw of this fish, and the road that leads to the basilica its backbone. The northern quarter, lying immediately beneath the cliff, represents the tail fin. Here may be found, albeit by prior invitation only, this being the only means of admission through La Porta di Montagna, the gate which bars the way, the estates of the gente elegante. Behind this gate dwell Frastinares great and good, ramped in ascending order of eminence on the lower slopes. On the highest level, hard against the cliffs, is the palazzo of the Marchese. Patron Saints. The patron saint of Frastinare, in whose honour the Byzantine-styled basilica was dedicated, is San Cassiano, the early Christian teacher who was martyred by his own pagan students. The architecture of the basilica incorporated various pre-Christian architectural elements. Notable among these was said to be the crypt, which was kept locked at all times, with access granted at the sole discretion of the Marchese. This crypt was reportedly decorated with a series of peculiar frescoes, details of which are regrettably scant. The basilica also boasted, in a side altar situated in the apse, the statue of a black Madonna, towards which certain obscure rites of private veneration were offered in the Lenten time. What now remains of the basilica is kept under lock and key, and requests for access by even the best-connected researchers are politely rebuffed. Princes and Prelates. The Marquisate of Frastinare dates back to 965 by donation of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. There is evidence to suggest that in 973, at the Great Assembly of Quedlinburg, Otto denounced Flavio, the reigning Marchese, upon receiving a submission from the Bishop of Verona. One commentator insists that the marquisate was actually revoked, but no formal proclamation was made before the emperor's sudden death in the May of that year. Neither Otto II nor his successors seem to have troubled themselves with Frastinare, and for several centuries thereafter the city features in no official reckonings of the emperor's lands. It is, however, numbered among the Wittelsbach possessions in the tale drawn up after the death of Louis IV, the Bavarian, but thereafter it slips once more into imperial obscurity. I met a traveller from an antique land. It is contended by at least one biographer of the Shelleys that the poet visited Frastinare during their residence at Lord Byron's estate at Este in the year 1818. That in fact it was following this visit that his infant daughter Clara sickened and died. A fragment of verse survives in the Bodleian's collection of Shelley's papers. Entitled The Mysteries of F, its first two stanzas describe a walled city by the Adriatic Sea and a debauched nobleman who makes obeisance to antique gods unnamed. The name of the city crops up in one further anecdote of the poet's life, or more accurately, of his death. In a contemporary account of the loss of the Don Juan and the deaths of Shelley and his friend, Edward Williams, here we draw upon the correspondence of a Venetian aristocrat who chanced to be holidaying in the area and who boasted of being on excellent terms with the Shelleys, the blame for the catastrophe is ascribed to the inexperience of their boat boy, a nondescript youth described as un ragazzo di Frastonare. Frescoes. There exist very few descriptions of the crypt of San Cassiano. Perhaps the most thorough is to be found in the recollections of a 19th century visitor from Ravenna, the provost Ugolino. Even he mentions the frescoes only in passing, and the prevosto devotes barely a paragraph to one other feature, the flowing frieze that runs along the walls of the stone steps leading down from the church to the crypt. He reports that it depicts some sort of maritime celebration, which he refers to as la festa degli abissi. This designation he neglects to explain. He notes only that it grows more wild and unchristian with each turn of the stair, culminating in what he describes as debauchery. Though infuriatingly short on concrete detail, the Prevosto's notes, preserved by his descendants, examined by me with their permission, do draw attention to the motif which runs as a border to the frieze. His rough sketch in the margin depicts what seems at first glance an abstract pattern of lines and curlicues. Closer examination reveals this as a repeated motif of fishes, tessellated top to tail, alternately coloured in blue and white. It may be noted that the pennant of the lords of Frastinare, which flew atop the watchtowers of the harbour and above the residence of the Marchese, is a stylized depiction of a fish, portrayed in blue against a white background. The significance of its appearance in the frieze, complete with mirror image, is open to debate. Perhaps here we may mention Ugolino's cryptic annotation, La città sotto le onde? The notion of a city beneath the waves, or a secret twin, has been raised elsewhere in the history of Frastinare. It seems at times as though all things connected with the town find their corresponding reflection in the clear blue waters of the Aegean. Concerning mosquitoes. Miss Bryony Staniforth, when visiting Frastinare in the spring of 1904, was advised by the proprietor of her hotel, the Casa Sirena, to keep the windows of her room closed and latched. She found this curious, as the mosquito season is known to begin rather later in the year, generally peaking in August and September. In any case, she understood there to be no marshes, and hence no breeding grounds, in the immediate vicinity of the city. In the true enquiring spirit of the independent traveller, Miss Staniforth left the windows wide open on the last evening of her visit. With an air of modest vindication, she relates that she experienced no unwelcome insect visitations. She does, however, remark that through the open window she was conscious of a most disagreeable smell, proceeding from the direction of the harbour, and what seemed, given the lateness of the hour, an undue amount of clamour in the streets. Before departing, Miss Staniforth brought this matter up with the hotel manager, who claimed to have no knowledge of what may have caused the disturbance. A likely story is her tart gloss on this exchange. In Dreams. In his book The Labyrinth of the Guilt Complex, the noted psychoanalyst Dr. Anthony Edwards describes a course of hypnotic psychotherapy he pursued with one of his patients, a 20-year-old woman identified in the text as Signorina D., the daughter of an Italian nobleman. From the transcript of their breakthrough session. Edwards: How old are you? D: Little, very little. Edwards: And where are you? D: In the street, the road from the villa to the Basilica. Edwards: Is there someone with you? D: Distressed: Yes. Edwards: Who? D: Fish, the fish people, all through the alleyways, crowding around me, pushing me along, the gente del mare. They have the heads of fishes, but they walk as men. Edwards: Are you scared of these fish people? D: Yes, very scared. Edwards: And who else? Who else is there? Is your father there? D: Of course, he wants me to come with him, but I mustn't. Edwards: What do you think your father wants you to do? D: To join with them, to marry. Edwards: Marry who? Who are you to marry? D: The lords below, but I won't. Edwards: The lords below? D: There are the lords above and the lords below, the lords of the gente del mare. They rule below, and my father rules above. Their will is his will. A strict Freudian, Dr. Edwards interpreted the fish-headed figures in Dee's dream as symbolic of her fear of the male's seed. This he linked with a deep sense of guilt surrounding Dee's unconscious desire to sleep with her father, thus claiming the place vacated by her absentee mother, divorced for many years and resident in America. The full notes of the case, held in the Edwards archive, reveal Dee to be Dalida di Frastinare, only daughter of Ubaldo, the Marchese. After fleeing Italy at the age of 18 to take up residence with her mother, the Marchesa, in New York, Dalida underwent numerous courses of psychoanalysis, all of them inconclusive. Over the course of the following decades, she seems to flit in and out of the affairs of the wider world, appearing in unexpected places and vanishing without notice. Perhaps Frastinare's secret is hers also. The City Under the Sea. In 1966, a team assembled by the Undersea Research Centre at La Spezia carried out experimental sonar research on the seabed of the northern Adriatic. This research was on behalf of NATO, and a full account of their findings is yet to be cleared for public access. However, the team included oceanographers from the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Oxford, and on the conclusion of their secondment, the leader of the British contingent, Professor Helen Bond, gave an interview to the Observer newspaper. In the photograph accompanying the article, Ms. Bond is shown pointing at a large map pinned to a cork board in her office. Frastinare, on its headland, occupies the top of the chart, while to seaward some curious formations on the seabed are sketched in vague and incomplete outlines. She mentions the region's history of earthquakes, and speculates that these anomalous features may be proof that the Frastinare promontory was once much longer. Indeed, she says, it seems quite probable that this vanished peninsula once formed the southernmost part of the town itself, and that there are sunken remains of ancient buildings waiting to be discovered, a whole underwater city, so to speak. Ms. Bond discusses her intention to raise funds to send a British diving team to the Adriatic, but no such expedition seems to have ever taken place. The seabed off Frastinare has attracted little interest since, although various images have been posted to the r/seapeople Reddit, which, it is claimed, depict odd submerged structures in the coastal shallows of the Golfo di Venezia. Mostre del Mare. Situated near the southern end of the amber trade routes, the Frastinare region was briefly notorious during the Roman era as a haunt of pirates. Ships carrying Baltic timber from Aquileia to Sicily and points south were said to be at constant risk of depredations from a gang of sea-borne brigands whose base was the well-defended harbour of Frastinare. In some contemporary accounts, these freebooters are referred to as Mostri del Mare, or monsters of the sea. This is an uncommon appellation, and scholars have interpreted it as suggesting something above and beyond those acts of everyday piracy which were all too frequent in those waters. When pressed on the matter, though, they declare themselves to be unable to be more specific. The vanishing of Issy Gerardi. In 1962, preliminary location filming took place in and around Frastinare for the Italo-American feature film Buongiorno Pazzabella, a co-production of MGM and Carlo Ponti. The film was intended to serve as the launchpad for the international career of Isabella Issi Gerardi, an up-and-coming Italian starlet. However, the production was abandoned after her unexplained disappearance in a boating incident. Despite intensive searches, her body was never found. A police investigation followed, and an inquest returned a verdict of accidental death under circumstances which remained a mystery. The ensuing lawsuit, brought by the Gerardi family, hastened the producer's decision to sell off the few thousand feet of film that had been shot for use as stock footage. A movie blog, since taken down but accessible in text form via the Wayback Machine archive, claims that one sequence later turned up in a banned Mondo documentary entitled Mondo Omicida. The clip, as our anonymous blogger describes it, takes the form of a long establishing shot panning across the harbour and is said to show Issi Gerardi, clearly visible at the helm of her dinghy as it sails out to sea. The boat disappears behind the guard towers for a moment. Then, as the pan continues on into open water, it is seen to be floating rudderless and free, with Gerardi nowhere in sight. Nethans. In the town square of Frastinare stands a fountain dedicated to Nethans, the Etruscan god of the sea. A marble effigy of the god is flanked by two anguiped demons in the form of mermen with double tails, from whose mouths jets of water flow into the fountain's bowl. In earlier times, these figures were generally referred to as the bambini, or children, of the deity. The fountain was the centre-place of a ceremony which used to be held each year in the drought-ridden month of July, on a date which fell between the ancient observances of Lucaria and the Forinalia. It took the form of a procession around the walls of the town, thence street by street towards the town square, where the girls of the town would dance around the fountain as if around a maypole, and the god would be garlanded with fishing nets. Some chroniclers have linked this celebration with the secret rites held in the crypt of San Cassiano. On the face of it, this seems unlikely, since it will be recalled that those rites took place during the Lenten time. Nevertheless, the suggestion of a linkage persists, as if the one ceremony might be the occult, clandestine mirror of the other. Once more, we find invoked in our studies of Frastinare the concept of dualism, of secret reciprocities, and once more our attention is drawn to the town's enigmatic connection with the sea. The Thelemites. During her time in New York, Delida di Frastinare struck up an acquaintance with Carl Germer, associate and benefactor of the so-called wickedest man in the world, Aleister Crowley. In his role as Grand Treasurer General of Ordo Templi Orientis, Germer was anxious to attract the well-heeled and credulous to the ranks of Crowley's adherents, and the two carried on a regular correspondence until Germer's death in 1962. In a letter from September 1943, which finds Delida resident in an upstate sanatorium, Germer makes the following curious request. My dear, can you furnish me with all relevant details of those most august and secret rites carried out by your family as Lords of Frastinare? What little you have told me is shockingly suggestive, and both the Supreme Grand Master and I consider the ceremonies to be a magical remnant of most ancient eons. Here, frustratingly, a page of the letter is missing. Germer resumes on the next surviving page the reality or otherwise of these monstrous sea creatures. But enough of these matters. Turning now to the pressing subject of finance, the rest of the letter is little more than a thinly veiled begging note, and need not detain us here. There is a rumour that Delida was present at an abortive performance of the so-called Babylon working, carried out in August 1945 by John Whiteside Parsons at the Agape Lodge on Orange Grove Boulevard in Pasadena. Throughout the spring and summer of that year, she is known to have been resident in Southern California, and in the Germer correspondence from this time she is addressed as Lady Babylon, suggesting that she may even have been Parsons' original choice for his partner in the ritual. We must suppose that the 1945 working did not manifest the desired results, for Parsons was soon to unveil a new Scarlet Woman in the shape of Marjorie Cameron, and Delida di Frastinare returned to the east coast before the end of the year. Her search for illumination had led her first of all to psychology, then to magic, and neither discipline seems to have provided the closure she needed. Hail, ruler of the sea! In the basilica, until quite recent times, there stood above the font a statue depicting what was popularly taken to be a priest or acolyte of some sort. In all extant descriptions, photography inside the basilica was long prohibited. The head is described as much damaged or even effaced. The sketch of the statue, which appears in the good Provost Ugolino's notebook, depicts the head with a curiously narrow and elliptical aspect, with bulging eyes and a strange sort of crown or tiara. The plinth on which it stood bore the inscription Ave Princeps Maris. The guidebooks describe it as a shrine to Erasmus of Formia, patron saint of seafarers, but this attribution has been questioned by several scholars. Indeed, a few of these dissenters place the statue's origins in the pre-Christian era and claim it as the likeness of some unknown pagan deity. The statue vanished in 1945, leaving only the plinth with its equivocal inscription. It's thought to have been looted during the chaotic days of the German retreat and the temporary occupation by Slovenian anti-fascisti, before the eventual restoration of order with the establishment of the Morgan Line. Brides. After leaving Frastinare, the redoubtable Miss Staniforth travelled along the coast to Trieste. Here she engaged a room at the Hotel Miramar and made it her base for the next fortnight. Among much else of less interest, she recounts a conversation she had with an old woman cleaning fish on the wharf in the Porte Vecchio. Were there, asked Miss Staniforth, any stories told thereabouts of the people of Frastinare? From which it can be deduced that something of her stay in that town was nagging at her still. The old woman claimed that no men dare wed the women of Frastinare, because they were all promised to the devils that live in the sea. The product of their union, said the nonna, would be no human child but a miscegenate. Ibrido sporco, she said, with what Miss Staniforth describes as undue vehemence, a filthy hybrid. Somewhat taken aback, the Englishwoman asked her to elaborate on this extraordinary statement. All the old woman would say was spose del Antichristo, brides of the Antichrist, this while pressing both hands against the sides of her face, mimicking, thought Miss Staniforth, the narrow head of a fish. Weird Tales. Among the files of correspondence in the Weird Tales magazine collection held by Eastern New Mexico University is a copy of a rejection letter sent by editor Farnsworth Wright to one Albert Jacopetti in the year 1937. Mr. Jacopetti's submission was entitled The Fiends of Frastinare, and unfortunately no copy of the manuscript survives in the archive. We know, because Wright tells us in his letter, that the story in question was a novella of some 23,000 words. As to its subject, in Wright's opinion it was a shameless plagiarism of H.P. Lovecraft's infinitely superior tale of The Shadow over Innsmouth. Tartly, he offers the following advice. Should you decide to resubmit, a course of action that I must warn you seems uncalled for, please consider finding a more original theme for your story. Also be advised that our editorial policy mandates the replacement of all actual place names and character names with fictional substitutes. The story appears not to have been resubmitted, nor can it be found by querying the archives of the Internet Speculative Fiction Database. Wright's censure seems to have put an end to Mr. Jacopetti's fledgling career as a writer, which may or may not have been Weird Fiction's loss. As with so many other elements of this story, we shall never know for sure. 1969 and after. An end of things. The Great Fire of Frastinare, which destroyed the Basilica of San Cassiano, along with the whole of the town centre, remains a mystery, like so much about this infuriating place. The cause of the fire was never ascertained. It's thought that it started in the crypt of the Basilica, during a ceremony held on Easter Saturday of 1969, and spread with frightening rapidity from house to house along the narrow streets. Over 60 people, many of them in attendance at the ceremony, perished in the blaze. Among them was the elderly Ubaldo, the last Marchese of Frastinare. So much of the town's history seems to have died with him. and the most of the present researcher can do is piece together such fragments as may still be uncovered. In 1975, a journalist working for Andy Warhol's Interview magazine called at the home of the late Marchesa di Frastinare, the leader's mother. Since the 1950s, the Marchesa, and latterly her daughter, had lived in a secluded property on the north shore of Long Island, where guests were rarely entertained. The compound was walled and its gates were locked, but after negotiations with the gatekeeper, the journalist was allowed to speak with the house via intercom. A voice on a crackling line announced that La Signorina saw nobody save by prior appointment. Asked whether such an appointment might be arranged, the voice answered flatly, "Non è possibile," and the gates remained locked. But was the leader even alive at that point? Nobody had seen her for years. She never resurfaced, and the researcher finally gave up her inquiries. At some point during the 1980s, the house on Oyster Bay was sold to a junk bond trader, and the family estate was quietly rolled up, its remaining assets disposed of, its bank accounts closed. What became of the mistress of the house remains one moot point among so many others. No death certificate under that name was ever filed in America or in Italy, and the most that can be said on the matter is that the last survivor of the Frastinares seems to have vanished into the tantalizing ambiguity that surrounds both her family and the town of her birth. 2 final fragments, 2 last index cards for the locked box marked Frastinare. First, the passenger manifest for the Air Italia flight from London Heathrow to Milan's Linate Airport on the 3rd of April 1969, Maundy Thursday of Easter week, bears the name of Delida di Frastinare. A corresponding return flight for the same passenger is also recorded on the Tuesday of the following week. Linate, it may be noted, is roughly 400 kilometres from Frastinare, and the journey is not arduous. Second, a portrait by the artist Remedios Varo, commissioned by the Marchesa in 1958 as a present for her daughter, and held in the private family collection ever since. What we know of the work is entirely restricted to a colour photograph taken in the studio of the artist. The painting, entitled La Naiade, y sus solteros, depicts the unclothed figure of a woman, thought to be Delida herself, standing between the towers of a harbour that is clearly meant to represent Frastinare. Her feet hover above the waves, which are glowing with an eerie luminosity that seems to proceed from tremendous depths, while the constellation of Draco is rising above her head in the night sky. Closer examination reveals that the windows of the towers are occupied by a host of fish-headed men, barely visible in the shadows.